Good morning. I'm Christopher Sayre, president of the LaRouche's organization, filling in for Harley Schlanger on Thursday, February 22nd. I want to read to you the first paragraph from an article entitled How Wolfowitz and the Neocons Sabotaged the First Oasis Plan. And this is from April of 2005. Quote, "The only hope for Southwest Asia and an Israeli-Palestine peace agreement is the implementation of Lyndon H. LaRouche's Oasis plan, where a Middle East peace can be organized around cooperation for regional economic development. Such a plan would necessarily involve the construction of nuclear-powered desalination plants and other infrastructure throughout the region, enabling an exponential increase in the water supply to make the deserts bloom." Now, I want people to think this through. Anybody who thinks about it deeply will realize that while a ceasefire is immediately necessary, and obviously we must immediately stop the slaughter of 2 million people that is now ongoing, if there were a ceasefire tomorrow, the death and destruction would not only continue, but it could very well accelerate through starvation, dehydration, and disease. The infrastructure is destroyed in Gaza. The hospitals are gone. One, of course, may come to the conclusion that that was the plan itself from the beginning. Gaza must be completely rebuilt. Obviously, a ceasefire is only the precondition for building a lasting peace. Peace not only between Israel and Palestine, but peace in the entire region. A peace based on development for all in the region. As Lyndon LaRouche warned before the Gulf War, the British geopoliticians and their neocon lackeys like Paul Wolfowitz or Victoria Nuland, to name a few, view the Middle East as a crossroads between Asia, Africa, and Europe, and seek to blow up the whole region in order to prevent the construction of the mutually beneficial Eurasian land bridge, as LaRouche and his wife Helga Zepp-LaRouche proposed. Do you think the progress of China's Belt and Road Initiative in the recent period has made those dark forces any less committed to blowing up the entire region? Now let's look at some of the history on this. And it's a proud history. President Eisenhower, gave his Atoms for Peace speech in 1953, proposing that we use atomic power for peaceful development instead of nuclear annihilation. Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion was one of the first to mention nuclear desalination in respect to the Arab-Israeli conflict. In the early 1960s, when it became clear that Israel's Dimona nuclear research complex was in fact producing nuclear weapons, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser told the Kennedy administration that the acquisition of nuclear weapons by Israel would become a casus belli. In a meeting at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York in 1961, President John F. Kennedy demanded that Ben-Gurion explain Israeli intentions at Dimona. And Ben-Gurion told the president that Israel's greatest problem was the shortage of water, a need that could never be fully met by the Jordan River. Therefore, Ben-Gurion said, with the advances of atomic research, Israel was preparing for the possibility of developing nuclear desalination plants. Unfortunately, the war faction in Israel has won out so far, and the development of atomic energy for nuclear weapons is the only advances being made. President Johnson later, in a continuation of the policy launched by Eisenhower and Kennedy, launched the Water for Peace program in 1965, holding its first international conference in Washington in November 1966. This was to be part of a much broader Water for Peace initiative that would lay the foundations for a Middle East peace. In April 1967, the Johnson administration was ready to appoint Jack Valenti, one of President Johnson's closest personal advisors, as presidential coordinator for the Israeli and Egyptian desalination projects. A month later, on May 23rd, 1967, there was a week-long conference. The United States State Department convened the International Conference on Water for Peace in Washington, D.C., with no fewer than 6,400 participants. There were delegations from 94 countries, including Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Yemen, and Saudi Arabia. The question of nuclear desalination and the development of nuplexes were central themes, but less than 1 week later, on June 5th, 1967, Israel launched the Six-Day War. Within days of the ceasefire, former President Eisenhower presented President Johnson with a peace initiative entitled A Proposal for Our Time. In cooperation with people from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, the proposal called for the construction of 3 dual-purpose nuclear desalination electric power stations, referred to as atomic desalting plants, one each to build in Jordan, Israel, and Egypt. They would produce a combined output of 1,400 million cubic meters of water a year, equivalent to the entire flow of the Jordan River system. Later, in June 1968, Eisenhower wrote an article about the initiative in Reader's Digest. The purpose of building large atomic desalting stations in the troubled region, Eisenhower wrote, is not only to bring large arid regions into production and supply useful work for hundreds of thousands of people, but also, hopefully, to promote peace in a deeply troubled area of the world through a new cooperative venture among nations. I am optimistic enough to believe that the proposal, when implemented, as it is sure to be someday, may very well succeed in bringing stability to a region where endless political negotiations have failed, Eisenhower wrote. Under a subtitle, A Power for Peace, Eisenhower wrote that the plants would be dual-purpose, producing both water and electricity in order to enable development across 1,750 square miles of barren land, which would form the centerpiece of a scheme to settle more than 1 million Palestinian refugees. As does LaRouche in his Oasis plan, Eisenhower pointed to the regional scope of the project. The electricity produced, he said, would be used in pumping water to areas as distant as Syria and Jordan, and perhaps under the Suez Canal to parts of Egypt. The rest would be utilized for the manufacture of needed fertilizer and other industrial purposes. A plentiful supply of electrical energy would bring to the Middle East vast new complexes of industry, just as it has to many other parts of the world. Eisenhower estimated that the project would cost $1 billion and would be funded through a specifically created international corporation supervised by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Quote, the collaboration of Arab and Jew in a practical and profitable enterprise of this magnitude might well be the first long step toward a permanent peace, Eisenhower wrote. Now that is a truly American idea. LaRouche further elaborated this idea in his Oasis plan, which clearly is not a new idea, but one that is absolutely needed right now. Immediately following the Oslo Accords, LaRouche stressed the necessity to, quote, put the shovels in the ground right away. But geopolitical opponents of the Accords were saying that political agreement must come before economic cooperation. LaRouche said, no, turn the dirt on the development projects immediately. During a September 8th interview in that year, LaRouche spelled it out. The urgent thing here is that we must move with all speed to immediately get these economic development projects, such as the canal from Gaza to the Dead Sea, a water canal, going. Because if we wait until we discuss this thing out, enemies of progress and enemies of the human race, such as Kissinger and his friends, will be successful through people like Ariel Sharon's buddies in intervening to drown this agreement in blood and chaos. But now we have an opportunity. End of quote. Ariel Sharon's buddies have indeed drowned the region in blood and chaos. Benjamin Netanyahu brags about the destruction of the Oslo Accords potential. But of course, the real question is, for whom did they do this? We have a chance now with the creation of BRICS Plus, 5 of whom are in the immediate region: Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Ethiopia. We can bring the promise of development to the entire region. Look at the bigger potential here. We could end this genocidal, colonialist nightmare world forever. China and Russia will play an obvious role in this, but the U.S. should return to its proud anti-colonial tradition, reflected imperfectly perhaps, but reflected in presidents such as Eisenhower and Kennedy. Of course, we need a ceasefire immediately. We need to stop the genocide immediately. And of course, we need peace. But this will only work if we have a concept of what we are replacing war with, because it is the enemies of this progress that launched this genocide in the first place. It is what they do, and they must be stopped. Join us in doing that. Endorse and circulate LaRouche's Oasis plan far and wide. Beautiful ideas are more powerful than guns and bombs. We'll see you tomorrow.